1. The Dead House. 9 years ago. He'd always thought the house was as dead as it looked, and that was precisely what gave it its name. Even then, after so many years and even a new life, Xander recalled the squeaky chain-link fence that encompassed the derelict old structure. Though there were many houses along the route Xander took on his way home from kindergarten, that one in particular always captured him. It seemed strange to think of it like that in hindsight, to use that word, capture, over any other, but it was always the first one that came to his mind when memories of the house arose. If he dared to dwell on the thoughts any further, however, it began to sound more appropriate. At first, if anything could really be credited for such a thing, it was the fence. The fence, like the house, he remembered, had been in disarray. The posts had, even then, long since shifted within their foundation and become bent from any number of times great abuses. The crusty, jagged network of strained wires strung between these tortured posts were skewed from their original intent, stretched to agonizing lengths in some places, or crushed to tight, misshapen gaps in others. Beyond that crooked barrier, both the landscaping and maintenance gave away a similar neglect to the property. If the fence was, indeed, what had initially captured Xander's attention, it was most certainly not the only thing about the house that held him. And there was another word that Xander felt an uncomfortable attachment to in that case. Holding. The sight of that gross entanglement of neglect and decay that might have once been called a lawn held his young gaze and dared him to look further, to ponder and even obsess further. What Xander felt must have been a beautiful stone display around a once impressive garden had since become a sight not unlike a private burial ground, the stones disjointed and jagged, jutting and cutting across one another with no aesthetic reason or intent. The garden had all but gone gray with dead overgrowth and choked out lilies and petunias that had fallen victim to a wave of ivy that, like its own prey, had since starved and grown dead and ugly. Beyond the death garden, for either a wandering eye or a daring intruder, was the winding, cracked path that led to the front steps. Even the act of looking at those steps seemed dangerous, as though the weight of his gaze might break through the split in the second of 3 steps, a rough and angular chasm of splintered wood that formed a hungry maw of empty space between the jagged, upraised planks. Then there was the porch. And while Xander had never seen anybody occupying that porch on any of his prolonged treks home from school, he distinctly remembered that the weathered and cracked wicker rocker resting left of the house's door was always swaying. Even on calm days with no breeze to speak of, the rhythmic squeaks and thuds of each pass of its bowed base against the uneven beams seemed to match the steady pace of his heart. Since he'd tried to convince himself that this was nothing more than an exaggerated detail that he'd added to the memories, a little something extra to drive the shivers up his spine as he dredged up the thoughts. Now that he'd come to know the real horrors, even made a career out of tracking and destroying them, he was certain that it was all in his mind. The rocking chair, he'd reminded himself time and time again, had been steady, and that it was only his young nerves, electrified from a day of schoolyard bullying and the growing anxiety of the abuse awaiting him at home, that rocked each time he passed to oogle the house. It had become something of a routine for him. What had started as a brief pause to appreciate, if such a word could have applied to such a scene, the sheer splendor of what he saw there. He'd been too young to appreciate the metaphor, but as the memories became filtered through his expanding awareness over the years, He could see how the house had felt like a representation of his life at that time. Like him, it was broken to an obvious point for all the world to see. They were mistreated. They were ignored. They were hurting. What was a brief routine became, through his unappreciated familiarity, a daily excursion. Seconds turned into minutes, and before long, Xander would lose track of the time altogether. He just kept searching for any sign of life beyond the uneven chain-link mess. There was just no hope to be seen, and that hadn't been for lack of trying. While he never dared to step beyond the threshold, he'd often take the time to move about the sidewalk in the hopes of glimpsing, from a new or unique angle, some sign of anything alive. But the property proved over and over that his morbid, adolescent fantasy of a dead house could, in fact, be possible. Especially when the only thing of color within the crooked and demented confines of that mangled fence was the front door. The bright red door, like a single blood-stained eye staring out at him, waiting. It only pressed against the ever-howling demand of just what could exist beyond such a barrier. A question, as it turned out, that would change his and his future wives' lives. But he hadn't told her about the dead house yet. Estella was life. Estella was hope. Estella was everything that the house lacked, and, in hindsight, maybe that was why Xander took her there. But before that mistake was made, there were still mistakes to be made on his own. At that time, he kept letting the house capture and hold his young gaze. Until the day came that staring wasn't enough for him. Until the day came that Xander learned that asking what dwells behind blood-red eyes is better left for the dead to concern themselves with. On that day, Xander had, as he had almost every day prior, with the exception of those rainy days when he'd been driven home by pelting urgency, paused in front of the house to appreciate, if such a word could have applied to such a scene, the sheer splendor of the sight. On that day, both the squeaky gate of the crusty, jagged chain-link fence, as well as the blood-red door that led into the unknown contents of Dead House, had been open. And, as though these changes weren't compelling enough, the rocking chair was almost certainly rocking. Whether or not he chose to believe that the past times he'd claimed the same memory were, in fact, figments of his imagination, there was no denying it that time. It didn't match his heart. It couldn't. A jackhammer would have been able to. The scene on that day, gaping gate and gaping door and gaping jaw, made certain to send Xander's young heart into his throat and bang like a drum. Something, someone, had been occupying that chair. Trembling at the alien potential of this discovery, Xander had done what he'd never dared to do. Tiny, quivering fingers laced between the links as he brought his face in tighter against the barrier, until the sequence of metal disappeared between his eyes, and his view offered the illusion that he'd somehow gone past it. To his left, still swinging freely and squeaking loudly, was the open gate. So lost Xander in the eerie exuberance of his fantasy-driven curiosity, he'd nearly wet himself when he'd heard the first bark. Body lurching at the sound, he'd faltered, catching the inside of his pointer and middle finger of his left hand on the links of fence and cutting himself as he stumbled onto the sidewalk. Then, as he'd assessed the damage in his bleeding hand, he'd heard the second bark. It was as though the German Shepherd had been there all along, standing with a rigidity and determination that, to that day, still reminded Xander of the army men he'd seen in movies and television. Standing by the suddenly still rocking chair, the hackles on the dog's shoulder had begun to shift and raise with fury, and Xander's breath had caught in his throat at the sight of the dog's teeth as its lips curled back in display. The squeaky gate made yet another whining pass, the shriek of its rusty hinges sounding like a dinner bell. That was when the dog lunged. For the first time ever, Xander had been forced to run home as the first sign of life to emerge from the house chased him down the street. And it was then, with the sweet serenity in the soft, glowing light of sundown sullied by the sound of barking and screams, that Xander learned the first lesson that Deadhouse would teach him. When one spends too much time prying in the affairs of the dead can, and very often will, pry back.